So what's the fatherhood forfeit, and have you fallen into the trap of it? Do you feel shame? Are you guilt-led? Are you exposed to conversations in the playground, in the workplace, that suggest that you're not good enough, that you're not successful, that you don't work hard enough, that you might be a bit lazy? Are you one of the managers or the supervisors or leadership of an organization that are preventing dads really being a part of the caregiving part of their family? Are you playing into stereotypes? In this conversation with Dr. Jasmine Kelland, I explore all sorts about the fatherhood forfeit and what organizations can do, what dads can do, what moms can do, what society can do to help dads really positively move into better caregiving for their kids. It's a really good chat. I hope you get loads from it. Please do engage, ask questions, follow, share, tag a dad who might need to see this. And we'll see you again very soon. Enjoy the conversation. Hello and welcome along to the Dads in Business video series podcast. My name is Rob Taylor from Dads in Business, where we get experts, business coaches, performance coaches, business leaders, and academics together to talk openly about dad life and what that means for us dads, and how we can do the best to bring out the best of ourselves to home and to work. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor.
Doctor. Not yet, I'm afraid. I'm Doctor.
Dr. Jasmine, give yourself a better introduction than I can. Who are you and what do you do for us dads?
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to have a chat with you today. So I'm a lecturer in HR and leadership at the University of Plymouth, but the reason kind of why we're having a chat today is because my research area is looking particularly at dads in the workplace and looking at the sort of challenges that dads face when they want to take an active role in caregiving. So that's very much the research space that I've been working in for kind of nearly 8 years now, and something that I'm really sort of passionate about and happy to be talking about today.
Wow. And why dads specifically, Jasmine? What intrigues
and well, kind
you
of, I'll
that?
tell you sort of maybe my story a little bit. That might kind of be helpful. So, so when I sort of started at university, you need to do a PhD as part of your sort of work, and so I was looking at sort of topics that interest me, and I was kind of struggling to find a topic really that I thought really sort of motivated me and made me feel like really sort of inspired. And so and then I was kind of thinking, what do I sort of spend most of my time with my sort of family and my friends discussing? And I actually thought about this condition at the point. I've got 3 daughters and they're teenagers now, but at this point they were quite a lot younger. And I was thinking, actually, what really sort of I spent a lot of time discussing what kind of irritates me is kind of some of the challenges that we face as a family when we've both worked full time the whole time, and some of the sort of gender stereotypes and the challenges around that. So I thought actually I spent a lot of time talking about that, and a lot of time talking about how I work full time, but still the expectation in sort of society is that I will take the primary caregiving role. And so the school will always call me if there's any issues and things like that. And that was something actually I'd really like to explore that a little bit more. So I started sort of thinking, okay, I'm going to look at sort of parents in work. And then actually the stuff that was coming out quite early about the dads and some of the discrimination dads were feeling felt a little bit like stronger data to me. So then I thought actually I'd really like to explore that a little bit more. And because it was kind of really interesting to think the experience that my husband faced in work was very similar to the experience that lots of dads have faced. And then I thought actually I want to sort of focus a little bit more on that and talk more to dads and sort of delve into that a little bit more. And that's what I've kind of been doing in my PhD and since then with sort of subsequent projects to really sort of explore what it's like for dads when they want to take an active role in caregiving and some of the challenges that they face.
Wow, I mean, it sounds fascinating. What a chunky piece of work, and I think a timely piece of work as well, isn't it? It's something that's becoming more prevalent and relevant, I think, as households probably need more than one income now. It's not the way it used to be. Things are changing. Men want to take that more active role, but the research that we've done, granted it'll be a smaller sort of straw poll piece of research, but it suggests that I think it's 3/4, about 77% of dads that we've asked believe that stigmas still exist around what a dad should be. I mean, do you recognize that as well? Is that something that
definitely. And I think it's kind of so surprising if you look at the sort of labour market stats of how many mums, for example, work full time now. So in theory you should have, therefore there should be more households in which the father will work part-time to sort of take up the load at home, but that doesn't seem to happen. And there still seems to be this kind of breadwinner for men and homemaker mentality for women in society, which is just so surprising when you look at the labour market stats, and it's incredible that still kind of prevails. But certainly the research that I've done is focused on something that I've called the sort of fatherhood forfeit, which is about some of the challenges and trying to articulate some of the challenges that fathers face when they want to take an active role in caregiving, and sort of to be really explicit about what that looks like and how that feels like, and how that can be a real sort of barrier for fathers when they're trying to take an active involvement. The kind of challenge being that it makes, for many dads, it will make them think, actually, you know, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm going to just carry on as I am, which will then often, for many families, will force the mother to remain in full-time work and take on the primary caregiving, or be in part-time work when they want to be in full-time work. So this research is very much about, it's about choice and people having options and not being discriminated against, whatever those choices are. If families decide that no one's going to work, if they decide that everyone's going to work full-time, if they decide that they want, the mum wants to work part-time and the dad wants to work full-time, of course that's fine. It doesn't matter. What this research about is about fairness, and that people shouldn't be discriminated against when they're making decisions that are right for their family.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, this isn't a woe is dads or anything, but I think there are a lot of pressures on dads to be the caregiver, be the breadwinner, be the provider, be open to equality, and all that sort of, you know, everything that goes on. And absolutely, the workplace should be an equal place of opportunity and pay and everything like that. I'm not a woman, I'm not a mom, I can't say I've experienced that, and I work for myself, so I'm not in the workplace as such. But an observation might be, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, to have true equality, don't we need to look after the dads as well, and not come at it from women need more, moms need equality?
And that is, we're not getting anywhere with that. We're kind of reached a bit of a stalemate. And I think I'm kind of, I speak very much as a working mum about this. I just think we've reached a bit of a stalemate. And I think until we have sort of dads accepted at home in the way that women are accepted in work, that's not without its challenge, I know, but I think we're going to keep stalling on gender equality. We need to actually look at how we can make it more acceptable for dads to be taking the lion's share at home and to want to work part-time, and support them a little bit more. Otherwise we're never going to move. It's really sort of stalled. And certainly my argument is that this is one of the reasons why it's stalled, and we need to look at dads being primary caregiving dads, and we need to look at dads in the workplace a little bit more if we want to have more equality for men and women.
And I guess to flip it from outside the professional space as well, I've seen it where dads are, I don't know if it's deliberately or consciously, but excluded from social circles in school.
Yeah,
so you
definitely.
go on a school run, for example, and you're almost like the outcast. You know, I try and do school drop off with my kids 3-4 times a week, and I've not experienced it massively, but I know dads that are more primary caregivers, and they're not included in the WhatsApp chat.
And that's kind of really sort of key. This sort of WhatsApp chat is really sort of central to that, I think. You think there's so much of it where people just aren't invited to groups, they're ostracized. People, dads, one of the participants in my research talked about it being like a viper's den going to a play school, and just found it was really sort of complex for them, because every time they'd go, they'd feel like they didn't quite belong, and they'd feel really like left out, and it's just quite isolating for some dads, which means just kind of transmits the message that this kind of isn't acceptable and this isn't the right place for you to be, which could be very off-putting. And sometimes if you're looking after a child full-time, that can be a lonely business. That can be really, really lonely. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, that's just quite lonely. But lots of the dads that I've spoke to were sort of saying actually they felt that it was worse for them, because they felt that their sort of mums had other support, but their mums, whereas for dads they felt quite excluded.
There's that that BBC program called Motherland. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, that just
there's the token guy. There's the one guy, isn't there?
and all the jokes are about him and his trying to be involved, and it's just like, it's kind of so true, but kind of like they're kind of making the mockery of it. It doesn't really help, I don't think. But it's just like
no. I'm not like saying I'm offended by it, but it's very obvious that that's the exception. Look, there's the token guy, and he's overly excited about everything with his kids and stuff. Can't just be a normal guy or a normal dad, can it? It has to be.
Yeah, exactly. And then one of the things that I sort of talk about in my research is this kind of mockery, and this kind of view that actually people, it's something to be laughed at, something to be sort of teased, and sort of kind of why are you here? What for? Why that's something that's funny and to make a joke of. And you think actually, well, it's not that funny. It's like a dad wants to be there. I don't understand why that's like so novel, but it's still kind of very much something that's like people are sort of really sort of will tease somebody about it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, isn't it? And you mentioned about your research, and you've written your book here for caregiving fathers in the workplace, and you've mentioned it briefly in passing, and it sounds so. I connected with it incredibly well when you mentioned the fatherhood forfeit, and I'd love to know what you see as that, and well, what is it for a start, and how do we know if we've fallen into the trap? What
Okay, so it's got like a number of different sort of elements. So the first element that I sort of report on is that actually fathers are less likely to get a role that helps them manage caregiving alongside work. So they're less likely to get a part-time job that we particularly looked at in my research. So what I asked people to do in my research for that project was I asked them to I asked managers to rate fictitious applicants, and some of them were dads applying for a part-time role, some of them were mums, and then some of them were full-time people, mums and dads, and it was the part-time father was significantly rated less. So therefore the sort of inference is that you're less likely to get a job sort of for enabling you to combine caregiving and work. So the sort of next part of my research was to explore kind of why was the part-time dad so sort of popular compared to the other sort of scenarios. So I wanted to explore that a little bit more, and as a result of that I did focus groups, and I've done interviews with both with parents and so mums and dads, and also with managers and HR managers to explore more widely what some of the issues are. And so the sort of next element of the fatherhood forfeit was that fathers they forfeit a good work experience. The workplace experience is forfeited a little bit in a number of sort of specific ways, and some of the ways that I sort of talk about is that fathers are considered to be secondary parents no matter what their family circumstances are. So whether they are a full-time dad, whether they are the primary carer, they're always kind of considered to be secondary, and that will sort of manifest very much in if they take their kids to school, for example, they're always sort of faced with this idea of where's mum and why isn't mum here, which that kind of constantly transmitting a message that you're not quite as good and that you're like a little bit secondary. So one of the sort of phrases that I sort of had was this assumption that someone's think mum, think child. So people sort of in the workplace and sort of socially think mum and child go together. So when the dad's there, it confuses people. So straight away people are met with, why mum couldn't make it and you're the secretary. And also kind of closely linked to that is that you're not actually the dad has felt that he wasn't actually as good as the mum. So sometimes some of the dads were sort of talking about when they go to events with their children, for example, the other mums will then sort of critique, but they will say, don't forget, one of the quotes is around, don't forget the wellies tomorrow, and don't forget there's a trip, oh, you haven't done their hair right, and that sort of thing, in a way that the dads were sort of saying, no one would ever say that to a mum. Whereas the dads were like this constant kind of over mothering of their children, was like, actually, I'm fine, I know exactly what I'm doing with my kids, you don't need to remind me because you wouldn't remind a mum. So this kind of, that's the sort of second element, is that sort of fathers felt they're secondary. The next one closely linked to that is the fathers felt that they got less support, so they get less workplace support for caregiving, so they're less able to have flexibility. And one of the sort of key things that came out of that research was that fathers were saying that sometimes they could get flexibility, they could pick their children up from school if they were sick, for example, or they could go, but it was very much subject to negotiation in a way that it wasn't for the mums. They felt that they had to negotiate and make up quite a story to be able to leave, and whilst they might be able to eventually, they felt that they really needed to actually negotiate that and to explain. And one of the things that came up quite a number of times was this idea that they had to sort of exclude everyone else in their family and give their explain where everybody else was before they'd be allowed to go, which for a mum, the mums, I suppose, you never recounted that. Mums were just sort of saying, you know, my child's sick, I need to go, and that was easy. Whereas for the dads, what they were saying is that if they get a call saying their child was sick, it would be, why can't your wife go? What about your mum? Can the school keep them? Is there a nursery? What about a childminder? Okay, then you can go. I think actually I'm their dad, my wife might be in another country, like why do you have to ascertain the whereabouts of my whole network?
Is there a random stranger that could pick up your kids?
Have you asked the neighbour? Well, why would I? It's my child, I want to go, I need to be with their parents. So it's this kind of, that was kind of something that came up quite strong again because it's really interesting to talk to mums, because we weren't talking to mums about dads, we were talking to mums about their experiences, and in there recollections, there wasn't any reference to these sort of things. And then the last element of the fatherhood forfeit was this idea that fathers face social mistreatment. So this had been seen in previous studies in the US before, but like what I sort of found was like a slightly different angle to it, so a more sort of detail about the way that they face social mistreatment, and that was in the workplace and also sort of more so socially. Mockery, which we mentioned before. One thing that was interesting that came out is that dads who took an active role, so reduced hours, or for example, would be stay-at-home dads, were considered that was a choice because they were a little bit idle, because they were work shy, or there was some reason why they were just a little bit lazy. Whereas for mums who made that choice, mums were sort of explaining how they sort of felt that was quite supported, and people understood that naturally they'd want to work reduced hours. But when dads did it, it was associated with trying to avoid full-time work and being a little bit work shy, which is quite a difference and feels quite different if people are saying things to you to imply that you're a little bit lazy. And there was sort of one quote that always kind of sticks in my mind, which was a mum, and she was talking about a stay-at-home dad at her school, and she said, I see him every morning, and she said, when I think about it, she said, all I think about is go to work, you lazy. And then she said, I know we all feel the same. And I think that's just so like shocking to say that. Because would you think that if there was a mum there, a full-time mum? I mean, of course you would. That's not something that would come up. And I think that's just kind of quite telling, really. And then the other element that we've kind of talked about a little bit then was kind of this idea that you struggle with friendships, that dads were saying that when they were going to play groups, when they were sort of doing things with their children, they did struggle to make friends, and they felt really isolated by that and felt quite uncomfortable going to school events and play groups and things, because they felt that they sort of struggled to make a network. And aligned to that is an idea that they felt that people were viewed their choice a little bit suspiciously. So when people were sort of saying that they were full-time dads or working part-time, for example, people genuinely thought that was a little bit suspicious. So there was something a little bit off. So whether that be they were a little bit like, why are you doing that? Kind of a quirk. People talk about a quirked brow, so people are a little bit like, a bit weird, which is just like, it's just like, I don't know, I'm laughing, but it's not funny. But I just think it's just not that unusual. I don't understand why people felt it was so suspicious. But assuming that there was something sort of more complex in the family, some complicated reason why they did that, was a bit like, is everything all right with your wife? Kind of, why are you
here almost?
Why are you here? Doesn't your mum like being a mum, and these sort of things? Do you think, well, it's just not that? And sometimes for some families it's just financial. So for some families, the mother would have liked to have worked part-time. She earned more, so she was working full-time. Some mums weren't particularly happy with that, but that was the setup. And so there's nothing suspicious about that. It was just a financial decision that parents made, and they had to make it work, really. And kind of more generally, really, negative judgment was kind of evident throughout the data set, that fathers were sort of felt they were judged negatively in work and outside of work by making their choice to take an active role in caregiving, which is quite surprising if you've got two parents who are both working full time, and one is, you need to manage the school runs within your sort of working day. The idea that the females would face challenges, and then the women face challenges, the men do. It just seems a little bit strange to me, really. So that's the kind of main elements, really, of the forfeit.
It's fascinating. I mean, what on earth are we supposed to do? We can't win. I've been scribbling some notes down here, sort of follow-ons to those. I mean, I just wanted to ask, before we dive into those follow-ons, is this mainly a women's perception of men in this circumstance, or is it other men's perception of men as well?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed a number of different people. So I interviewed women, interviewed mums, I interviewed dads. I'd also interviewed managers, and so these are the themes that came out quite strongly across all of the areas. So there's quite a few different angles within that, and also did focus group with managers of men and women. So both, really.
Yeah, it's there's all of those 4 or 5 points that you mentioned. They seem to always fall into like a bucket of shaming dads. I've written there, it's shaming. Yeah, they're always made to feel not good enough. Like, what's the measure of success? Almost like, why are you here? Why aren't you at work? Why don't you have a job instead? There's that old thing, isn't there, of how the first question you ask is, oh, you're busy, very busy. It's always assumed that you're busy with work.
Yeah.
Whereas if a dad was to prioritize looking after their kids instead of work, I think you mentioned or alluded to it, they're deemed as not not a success. It's like you've almost
Yeah.
failed.
Yeah, and it's assumed that it's about laziness, whereas that's rather than kind of thinking, oh, you're a really good dad.
Mm.
It's kind of a bit like, oh, okay, that's, why aren't you at work?
Yeah, don't want to work that one. What's
Yeah,
wrong with him almost?
yeah,
So
and then
maybe not
that's
good enough.
kind of a little bit sort of it sort of edges into sort of deviance, and that kind of notion of deviance. It's like
Mm.
it feels a little bit deviant, which it just surprised me in the data. It continues to surprise me because I just think actually it's really not that deviant to want to
Yeah,
support. And
and
if
I guess that,
we only looked at people only because that's who came forward, who were in a relationship with the mother, and that's just who came through my sample. It wasn't who kind of by choice really, but there was if you want to support your partner in the bringing up of your children, it's really doesn't seem to me that deviant or suspicious. But
no,
it's
not at
surprising
all.
how people do view that.
Either purposefully or subconsciously, we are shaming dads in a male population.
Yeah,
That's going to be a hard tide to turn, isn't it? Because
yeah.
if you're shaming people, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to open up
Mm.
and embrace change. I'm
I
going to
think what
hunker
was
down.
interesting, and I think kind of with sort of research I've done sort of since the dads I've put to since, a lot of these a lot of the comments that were made, I would say, were not made with intent. They were made conversationally, they were made as a little joke. But the kind of what they sort of say in the literature is that it's kind of, they call them microaggressions. So actually they translate as microaggressions when often they were just meant to be the age-old sort of banter and conversations, where actually I think kind of more awareness in that's not appropriate, and sort of socially to kind of cut that down. I think that's something that everybody can do really, is kind of, if you do hear that sort of humour, and certainly I remember when I sort of first started in HR, people would make sort of racial sort of slurs all the time, and they would make them and they'd say, oh, it's just banter, it's just joke. He or she can take it, when it wasn't appropriate then. And over the years that's been called out. You don't see that in the workplace now. I don't see that in my workplace, and I haven't for years, where people would make a joke about somebody's race and make a microaggression about that. Most people don't do that anymore. Some people will, but most people don't. It's not acceptable to do that in society, to do that in the UK society. So I think we need to be better at challenging these microaggressions. When you hear people like, oh, what are you doing here? Like, kind of just be like, he's a great dad, let's just move on, and then just kind of to challenge it at a very, very micro level, because I think that can have a huge impact.
I agree, yeah, and it's interesting you talk about the banter side of things. Yeah, I can take a joke, it's fine. It doesn't impact me in that way. But you're right, it's every other sort of gender, race, minority, whatever you want to say. You cannot have banter, as you call it, microaggressions towards them. But the dads ones, like you said, they said it perfectly
Open
innocently.
season.
They just said it as banter, and it's all right because you're a man. It's all
Yeah.
right because you're a dad. And what you're
Yeah.
saying is, it really isn't.
No, and it's still, you would not do colour, and you wouldn't, if you did it, it wouldn't be something that would be acceptable. And there should be no expectation, I think, in organisations or socially, that you can say that. And some of the things that kind of there was one sort of quote that I used quite a lot for sort of presentations, and it was one of the sort of really senior HR director who was talking to me, and he was saying, he said, if a dad works part-time and has an active role in caregiving, he said he needs to accept that there's going to be a lot of piss taking. And he was sort of saying the sort of things that you would say is, she rules the roost, wears the trousers, she dominates you. And he was saying it was really gentle. He said, but that would be part and parcel. And you think, why should you have to put up with that? Like, yeah, it's not on, and it's like, you shouldn't have to put up with all those sort of things. And certainly as a full-time working mum, I think sometimes probably there were people who have made judgments about me over the years, but you wouldn't feel so that you could be so open about saying that. I don't think that's something that, again, it would be so acceptable to kind of say, don't you love your children, blah 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 blah, but on all the assumptions that come with mums. And I just think there's a huge piece of work to do, but I think it can be distilled to something quite small, but can be quite impactful. And so some of the work that I've done with organisations is about sort of changing their policy around sort of banter, and changing their unconscious bias training to be able to incorporate this discrimination for caregiving fathers, but also for all of us, just if you just call it out, just kind of say, because they probably don't mean it like that.
No,
but
it is a perfectly innocent comment, but I guess somewhere under there, if we want things to change in a positive way, everything becomes more equal. We've got to stop dad shaming, if you like, haven't we? We've got to stop that. And the shame is a powerful emotion. Like I say, it probably makes you do this rather than this. But also you mentioned around, I guess with Fatherhood Forfeit, it connects quite well, is sacrifice. I'm almost sacrificing my potential to realize the best in my career if I choose to look after my kids more.
Yeah.
Is there a balance to be had? Can you have both, or do you have to sacrifice something?
Yeah, and I think the sacrifice thing, I think, kind of exists for men and women. I think if you do have time out of your career, for men and women, I think that really affects your career. I think the challenge for dads is, I think, because of the associations with the caregiving, you're viewed a little bit differently. So I think whilst for women, some of the challenges are that you kind of have time out of the labour market, for example, and you can never quite get back to where you were, and people will think you're not quite as sort of career driven in the same way. I think for men, people are more sort of thinking that you're not quite as trustworthy, and we don't really understand what happened there, and so you've still missed the time in the same way. But I think some of the perceptions are a little bit different, and because there's this sort of, we do talk a lot in sort of my space about the ideal worker norm, and sort of the ideal worker norm is that someone's readily available to work, they'll work any hours, and that they put their work first. Whereas actually this really contradicts that, and the ideal worker norm for men is really, really strong and really sort of dominant. So I think the idea is that once you sort of say that I want to work, say, part-time, or I want to, sort of work different hours to support my children, then I think that kind of deviates away from the ideal worker norm. And whilst people might not articulate it, when people are shortlisting, there might be that little element of suspicion.
Yeah.
That's certainly what came out of my research. People were sort of, they couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they didn't like that guy as much. They didn't trust him. They did some of the measures that I looked at was kind of commitment and perceived competence and promotability and hireability. And on those measures, people were just not rating the dad who wanted to work part-time to take an active role in his children's life as highly as the mums who were saying that. So when mums were saying that, they were like, oh, that's, I understand that. Whereas for the dads, they were just not rating it highly. They didn't like it.
So it's a strength for the moms and a weakness for the dads.
Yeah, which I didn't expect, actually. When at that point of the data collection, that wasn't what I expected.
Well, we see in the sessions that we've done with organisations before, where again we run the straw polls just to sort of check in with the content, make sure it's connecting. And is there something about sort of workplace competition? Because we see there was a manager of a certain level, and he said his manager purposely puts meetings in at 7 a.m. to cause disruption, to make him choose almost between school drop and work. What a terrible culture!
Why would you do that?
It sounds horrible, doesn't it?
But I guess I get why you do that.
There is that sort of man up, that one-upmanship, that I'm there at 7, you're not, I work harder than you. Is that things that show there where you say promotability is less because they want to work part-time?
Yeah.
I want to do a 7 a.m. meeting, why don't you? I'm better than you.
Yeah, and that is very, and I think that's very much, again, associated with this idea of the ideal worker, that you are always available for work and work comes first. And there is that kind of expectation that men in particular will put work first, and they'll put that above their family, and that makes you a sort of good citizen. So by doing that, that makes you somebody who is likable and trustable, because actually we understand that, and you understand that in the home space and in the workspace, because that's something that aligns to our norms of what we expect. But I do think that things are a little bit changing with this, and it's slow and it's not as quick as we kind of, I think we all kind of might have hoped with COVID, but I think there has been a real change in that people have seen the home and the workspace a lot more entwined. We sort of interviewed quite a lot of parents during COVID and during the lockdowns, and there was a real sort of sense that a lot of the dads are sort of saying, I'm really enjoying being around my kids more, I'm enjoying being home a little bit more, and I'm going to push back more about my hours. And whilst there hasn't been the real sort of change in the data about that, not that I've seen, it might be, but I haven't seen it. But what's interesting, and that was just kind of highlighted to me this week, is there has been some data from the ONS showing that the rates of stay-at-home dads have really crept up since COVID, and then they're the highest rate they've been for years. So that's really kind of the first sort of change that you think actually people have found, I want to do things a little bit different. I am fed up of leaving at 7 and coming back at 9. I want to see the kids, and I've enjoyed seeing them, and I think that's because of COVID. So I think we will start to see that, and obviously it takes a long time for the data to sort of catch up, and it takes a long time for people to actually make the change. People sort of say things at the time, but whether they're actually going to put their money where their mouth is and make the change, it takes time. But hopefully we will start to see that change, I think. And I think people will vote with their feet, because so many organisations are offering so much flexibility now
I think
post-COVID for everybody, not just parents.
I'd say that comes with risk as well. Some of the early research that we carried out just after lockdown, I think it was summer 2020 or 2021, guilt had gone up. This was for working at home, so guilt. And I can resonate with that. An example would be, I didn't have a home office, so I had to shoehorn a desk into my bedroom. I was like, I'm going to work. And I was always so adamant I was going to work. And I could hear the kids screaming downstairs. I was thinking, no, I'm at work. But it made me feel guilty. So I can kind of see where the workplace guilt when you're working from home comes in. Distraction, that's an obvious one, isn't it? Is the television on? Is the music on? Is the postman here? Whatever it is. So distraction went up as well. There's also, we found, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's a decent majority where there's an assumption, either implicit or explicit, that if you're working from home, you're always on call.
Yeah.
So that kind of
it's like an always-on culture, isn't it now?
Exactly. So what more pressures are we putting on dads and moms here in this case? So what if you're always on, then you're always distracted, and you've always got your mind wandering to work. Are you ever actually present with the kids? Work from home works in a technical sense, but is it working in the long term for men and dads and moms to really be this or
I think there's a huge thing kind of post-COVID is that I was talking about this with my final year class yesterday, and there's many organisations I think that have not done any sort of flexible working in earnest, and now sort of saying we do working from home, and therefore we are flexible and we're really family friendly. But actually, working from home isn't the only option for flexibility, but also for some people it really doesn't work. If you've got toddlers, working from home does not make your work-life balance easier. Working from home is massively stressful. It's cheaper on childcare, yes, but anyone who's tried to work with a toddler will know that is not a lovely work-life balance experience. It's hugely stressful. And so I think there's still sort of organisations need to go further with looking at what they offer, and saying that people can work from home is not enough. Sometimes people want to go to work, they need to go to work, they need the distance, but they do want to be able to be home for bath times, for example, and maybe do a few hours in the evening, so that they want to, and then people are more open about that. So a lot of the sort of work's coming out of the CIPD now, and they've got some really good guidance on this, is sort of talking about actually people need to be able, you need to consult with their staff. What do people want? So then, does everybody want to work hybrid? Does everybody want to work from home? Does everyone want to be in the office? Like, actually consult with people what works for them, because that's very much going to depend on what their family setup is and what sort of support they've got at home. So for example, another project that I did during sort of COVID, we were looking at how couples manage it. And so if you were in a couple in which you're really, really equal and you both work from home, then actually that might work really well. You might sort of tag team breakfast and tag team after school, and between you can have a really kind of great work-life balance. But if you're in a family that doesn't share things as much, and if you're in a family where, for example, I mean, a lot of the people that we spoke to during COVID were saying that, when mums were saying that they were doing the majority of the sort of heavy lifting during COVID. So if that's your setup at home, then actually their working from home might be work really well for one part of the couple, but not the other part of the couple, because someone else is doing that on their own. So it very much depends on your circumstances. And so when organisations are looking at flexible work, it needs to be broader than just saying we're flexible because you can work from home. That isn't the answer.
That's not flexibility, is it?
It's not for everybody. Some people, it's like you need that, or the kind of old school sort of flexible working, looking at job shares and compressed working weeks and all this lovely stuff that people used to talk about before. No one really talks about it now. Everyone just talks about working from home, we're flexible. You think, well, you need to go further than that, because if you've got toddlers, for example, working from home isn't great. I've got 3 teenagers, and working from home isn't great with them either, because I work in hence the background's blurred. I work in a shed in my garden, but even the 3 teenagers come out, if you've got a minute, mum, if you've got a minute, mum, it's different pressures, but it's better if I'm not in the house, because then they'll just get on with their day. Whereas if I'm here, they're constantly coming in, and I'd love to talk to them. I'd adore to talk to them, but I just have work to do.
You have to do your job as well, right? It's the work from home thing. Really, I find it really curious, and it kind of goes back to a bit of the loneliness piece that you mentioned as well. I think there's some broader stats that suggest that 1 in 3 men don't have a close friend. If we're working from home in our garages or our bedrooms, and we're not having that physical interaction with our colleagues, who can become our friends as well,
Yeah.
there's a risk that that loneliness thing becomes bigger,
Yeah.
isn't there?
Yeah, and I think these issues become even more pertinent. And if you look at some of the sort of male suicide rates, they're shocking. And
Mm.
if you think about male suicide in the years that you're going to be a parent, they are so high. This is like, then there's many factors around that. But I think one of the sort of key factors that is around that is about these issues around sort of, how can you be a good dad? Are you meant to be a breadwinner? Are you meant to be a caregiver? And kind of how does that sort of work? And for most dads, they want to take an active role, but there's still so much pressure for men to be earning the most they can and to be at work and to be an ideal worker. So I do think this is an area that needs to be addressed for many reasons, for the benefit of the families, but also for many reasons. And the male suicide rates are just, I mean, they're just terrible in the
It's
UK.
3 times more prevalent than in women, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
is the statistic.
And in the UK, they're really bad compared to internationally.
It's staggering, and you're right. We need to. It's for conversations outside of this space, but we need to find out why that's happening. And
Yeah.
I can connect with the sort of the push and pull that we get that you're mentioning. It needs to be the caregiver, needs to be the breadwinner. It's like, well, I'm over here, but then I'm being pulled over here, and I feel it's too much almost. I can't do it all. So it's not surprising that escalates and becomes an issue greater than it needs to be.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned as well, I guess it connects onto the loneliness side, that I think you said that dads say there's less support for them. And I read some research once from I think it was the Fatherhood Institute, that suggested that 78% of working men are dads. And a high majority of them also say there's less support for them in the workplace than there is mums. So what can employers start to do? Do you recognise that? And what can employers
definitely.
start to
And
do?
I went to at Portcullis House in Westminster, sort of a fatherhood APPG meeting, and it was really, when we had a speaker there, they were really good, and they were sort of talking about the importance that dads should sort of parent out loud and to share their stories in a way that kind of conversationally that mums often will. And that's something I think to be really sort of, that has to come from the top of the organisation. You need to, if you have a CEO who leaves on a Wednesday to pick up his kids, rather than kind of leaving a coffee cup on the table and leaving your computer on to make out you're still there, or putting a fake meeting in your diary, those senior execs need to say, I am going to pick up my children on a Wednesday because they love it when they do. I'm going to do my hours later on. So, that's what I'm doing. And then when you see that from the senior people in the organisation, and this is something that came out with a lot of the research I did for the book, the last chapter on the book was talking to organisations who are doing really well in this space and talking about what they did. And they said, they were saying to me, one of the key things is this idea of role modelling. So looking at the senior team, what are you doing, and telling everybody that you're doing that, and being really explicit in that. If you need to do a school pickup, don't put a fake meeting in. Say you're doing a school pickup, but that needs to come from the senior people in the organisation, because your more junior members of staff are not going to do that for fear of repercussions unless the senior team are doing it. And the organisations that I spoke to who did this said once the senior team started doing it, everyone started doing it. Because actually, like, if you do need to pick up your kids, someone's got to get them, but you're still going to make up your hours. Or for some, they were sort of taking their lunch hour, then getting their children sorted out when they got home, and then going back to their computer when they could, or whenever they wanted to make their hours up. So people will invariably, they're not trying to avoid their hours. And actually, a lot of the stuff that came out of COVID was that, and generally on part-time workers, is that people tend to work more hours because they're appreciative of having that flexibility. So people will tend to hop back on, and they're not going to hop back on for the 45 minutes they missed. They'll tend to hop on for 2 hours. So that's almost like a separate issue. It's about burnout rather than people not doing their hours.
Yeah, and I think is it a generational thing? Are you seeing organisations where, well, I didn't get that opportunity, so you can't do it? Is there a leadership sort of playing into the stigma? We don't.
Yes, I mean, I think there is, and I think there's one of the sort of recommendations that I make in the book is about kind of management training and making sure that managers understand how this can affect their employees and how this can affect the dads that they're working for them. And some work that I did just before COVID with a colleague in France was looking at sort of how dads who are supervisors can really hinder other dads taking that leave. So if they've taken a very much kind of ideal worker, I'm not going to be actively involved in the childcare view, they will really hinder the people who work for them who want to do that. They will really sort of outwardly challenge that. And we called the sort of phrase sort of supervisory paternal gatekeeping, in that your supervisors were really trying to act as gatekeepers because that wasn't what they did, and they weren't happy about that, and therefore they wanted to stop that.
Wow. I mean, what a huge challenge there is to bring that real equality, because you're talking about supervisor level, not even senior management level.
No, that was very much a supervisor level, yeah.
Wow, incredible. So if there was one thing that a dad could start to do, a working dad who wants to get more involved at home without sacrificing and feeling lonely, without feeling the stigma, if there was one sort of simple, quick fix for a dad, to put you on the spot, what could they start to do? And then to couple that, what could a management or leadership of an organisation?
One of the, I'm talking about lots of different projects today, but one project that I was involved in was looking at dads who sort of made it work, who worked sort of flexibly. And I was and it was based on, there was an article in The Guardian that mentioned my research, and there was lots and lots of comments about it. There's over 1,000 comments. So we analysed the comments, and a lot of the comments were from dads who were working flexibly, for example. And what was really noticeable in them was the approach that they had. They had a really strong approach, and I'm going to swear now, so warning.
Yeah.
Called it the sort of fuck it fathers, and the dads were sort of saying, actually, I don't care what happens. And then it's how we can have that sort of attitude, but and there's the dads I was speaking, dads rather in that data were very much, you know, I don't care about the Christmas, I'm going to do it anyway. And so therefore, if people want to tease me or not like me, I don't care, I'm doing what's right for my family. And they're supposed to encourage people to do what's right for their family, and regardless of what's going to happen. And the more people can do that and to shout about it and to tell people that they're doing that, I think that's really important, and to encourage more honesty. And that almost answers your next question, really, because I think there's a real sort of piece around the senior management and the team, and making sure that your policy is correct and making sure that your policy is gender neutral, but also to be really openly talking about this. If someone's had a baby, don't just get them a bunch, you know, a fruit basket and then get back to work. Literally say, how's the baby sleeping, to the dad, and in the same way that you would a mum back off maternity leave. How are you managing it? Are you okay? Do you need more time? To really sort of parent out loud, I think was the phrase that was used at this APG meeting. And I think that's something to really encourage, I think, to people to be really, really open about that.
I remember on that point of don't we get a bunch of flowers or something, when I was still in employment when I first became a dad, I had my 2 weeks off that you're allowed, and you go back and I've said this many times before, it's like you've had a holiday.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, get back to it now, come on, you've been off.
Yeah.
And
whereas when you have women go back after maternity, all of the sort of discourse is very much around how's the baby sleeping, how are you getting on, what your childcare arrangements and all that kind of thing. And I know there's kind of physiological elements of that, but also if you're still a parent, you probably still aren't sleeping.
Yeah.
You're still up. Your life has still dramatically changed, and it's amazing how little that gets discussed, I think, with dads.
No, it's like the unspoken thing. Get back to the grind. Get back to the grind.
The best way you can support your family is by working for them and sort of support them financially. And then, you know, we have really moved on. That's not what we expect modern fathers to do, but I still think we still have, as a society, we need to tackle it a little bit more, because it still is quite complex.
It needs to flush out of the system in a way, doesn't it?
It's, definitely
a real complex issue. Jasmine, I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna wrap up and ask how we can connect with you. Where can we find out about your work and your other projects that you
generally I think a good Google search, I think that most of the things are online, so and certainly LinkedIn's probably the best one. I think LinkedIn, I try to keep that LinkedIn pretty up to date with all kind of the access to my research. And if anybody's listened to this and wants to hear more, just drop me an email. I'm always happy to chat, or if you want to sort of share your story, we're always looking for sort of participants. So if you do think actually you've got a brilliant story of how you've worked part-time and you haven't had any troubles at all, then it'd be great to hear from you. And if you've had stories where things have this completely resonates you, again, it would be great to hear from anybody with their stories, because we are always looking for participants and to learn more about how we can help dads and how we can improve the situation for dads. Super.
And what's next, Jasmine? What's the next project?
Next thing, I'd quite like to explore how things have been post-COVID. So we did some a lot of data collection during COVID, and there was lots of sort of real sort of talk from the dads of looking at sort of more flexibility, part-time working after COVID. So I would really like to go back to those dads and sort of see, have things changed at all, and if so, why, and if not, kind of why, really. So that's probably next. And also I'd like to explore the experience of fathers in prisons. That's the next sort of project that I'm going to start on after Christmas, is look at staff as fathers who are due to be released from prison and some of the challenges that they face. And I'm keen to explore what the sort of world looks like from them, and if the challenges are the same or if there's a different set of challenges.
Wow, you like to keep yourself busy in your garden shed.
Yeah, in the garden shed. Yeah, so glamorous.
Yeah. Jasmine, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to do so. You've been chatting to a bit of a sunny silhouette for the past 15 minutes as our winter sun comes across Sheffield.
I know, it's lovely.
It looks gorgeous. So I'm going to go out and enjoy some nice winter sun. And Jasmine, lovely to chat to you. We'll see you again soon. Take care.
You too. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.